At 6:14 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning, three Saudi Arabian warships crossed into the central corridor of the Persian Gulf, flanked by United States Navy destroyers, and took up positions along a shipping lane that Iran has claimed sovereign control over for the past 4 decades. What happened in the hours that followed did not just rewrite the security architecture of the Persian Gulf. It sent shockwaves through every energy market on the planet and forced Tehran into a position it has never faced before: strategic irrelevance in the waters it once dominated. This is a story the headlines are not telling properly. This is a story about a kingdom that just made the most consequential military decision in its modern history, about a regime in Tehran watching its last point of leverage evaporate in real time, and about a superpower that engineered the entire sequence without firing a single shot. What you are about to hear changes the way every analyst, every defense planner, and every oil trader on Earth understands the balance of power in the Middle East. To understand why Saudi Arabia's decision matters, it is necessary to understand what the Persian Gulf actually represents in global economic terms. The Persian Gulf is not simply a body of water. It is the single most important energy corridor on Earth. Approximately 21% of the world's total petroleum supply moves through these waters every single day. That translates to roughly 3 million barrels of crude oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz every 24 hours, feeding refineries in Japan, South Korea, India, China, and Western Europe. The daily economic value of that transit exceeds $4 billion at current market prices. Interrupt that flow for 72 hours, and global oil prices spike by an estimated $18 to $24 per barrel. Interrupt it for 2 weeks, and the International Monetary Fund's own projections suggest cascading recessionary pressure across at least 14 national economies. Iran has understood this leverage for decades. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, operating independently from Iran's conventional naval forces, has maintained a network of fast attack craft, anti-ship cruise missiles, and naval mines positioned along the northern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, specifically to threaten this choke point. At last count, the IRGC Navy operates approximately 1,500 fast attack boats, many armed with Chinese-designed C-802 anti-ship missiles with a range of 120 kilometers. Iran has invested an estimated $7 billion over the past 15 years, fortifying its coastal missile batteries, constructing underground storage facilities for naval mines, and training specialized units in swarm attack tactics designed to overwhelm larger warships through sheer numerical superiority. For 40 years, this threat has been Iran's insurance policy. Every time Western nations considered maximum pressure campaigns against Tehran, every time the nuclear negotiations reached an impasse, every time sanctions threatened to strangle the Iranian economy, Tehran's implicit response was always the same: push too hard, and we close the Strait of Hormuz. The economic consequences of that closure would hurt the world far more than any sanction could hurt Iran. The insurance policy worked because the mathematics supported it. A full closure of the strait would remove 3 million barrels per day from global supply against a total global consumption of approximately 101 million barrels per day. No combination of strategic petroleum reserves, alternative pipeline routes, and spare production capacity could replace that volume for more than 30 to 45 days. The Abqaiq-Yanbu pipeline across Saudi Arabia can divert approximately 5 million barrels per day, and the UAE's Habshan-Fujairah pipeline adds another 5 million. That still leaves a shortfall exceeding 10 million barrels per day, a deficit that would send oil prices above $200 per barrel within the first week of sustained closure, according to modeling by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. That is the leverage Tehran built its entire regional strategy around. That calculus held for 4 decades. Until this morning, what Saudi Arabia just did is something no Gulf Cooperation Council member has ever attempted independently. The Royal Saudi Naval Forces deployed 3 Al Riyadh-class frigates, each displacing 4,700 tons, and armed with Aster-15 surface-to-air missiles and Exocet anti-ship missiles, into the Central Transit Corridor, alongside the guided missile destroyer USS Fitzgerald and the cruiser USS Chancellorsville. But the warships were not the message. The message was what came with them: a formal declaration from Riyadh that Saudi Arabia would guarantee freedom of navigation through the Persian Gulf using its own military assets, independently of any American security umbrella, for the first time in the kingdom's history. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on the notification bell, because this situation is developing faster than any news cycle can track. and the next 48 hours will determine whether this becomes the most significant power shift in the Middle East since the fall of Saddam Hussein. The Saudi declaration did not emerge from a vacuum. It was preceded by 18 months of quiet military preparation that Western intelligence agencies tracked, but that received almost no public attention. Beginning in late 2024, Saudi Arabia accelerated a $29 billion naval modernization program that had been moving at deliberate pace for nearly a decade. Riyadh took delivery of 4 multi-mission surface combatant vessels from the Spanish shipbuilder Navantia, each equipped with the Aegis combat system, the same integrated weapons and sensor suite that forms the backbone of United States Navy surface warfare capability. Saudi naval personnel completed accelerated training rotations aboard American warships in the Pacific, an arrangement negotiated directly between the Saudi Ministry of Defense and U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Simultaneously, Saudi Arabia expanded its Eastern Fleet base at Jubail, constructing 3 new deepwater berths capable of hosting vessels up to destroyer class, adding fuel storage capacity of 340,000 barrels, and installing shore-based radar systems manufactured by Raytheon with detection ranges exceeding 400 kilometers across the Gulf's surface. These preparations were visible to Iranian intelligence. Tehran watched every construction crane, tracked every vessel delivery, and monitored every training deployment. What Tehran failed to understand was the political will that accompanied the military preparation. The internal dynamics within the Saudi government reveal why this moment arrived now rather than 5 years ago or 5 years from now. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has spent the past several years restructuring the kingdom's defense establishment, consolidating authority that was previously distributed across competing royal family factions, each with their own relationships with different branches of the armed forces. The consolidation meant that for the first time, a single decision-maker possessed both the political authority and the institutional control to commit Saudi military forces to an independent security posture in the Gulf without requiring consensus from rival power centers within the royal family. The economic motivation is equally precise. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 economic transformation program requires stable energy export infrastructure that does not depend on Iranian restraint. The kingdom exports approximately 2 million barrels of crude oil per day, generating revenue of roughly $580 million daily at current prices. Every day of disruption in Gulf shipping costs the Saudi treasury directly, and the indirect costs to foreign investment confidence in Vision 2030 projects multiply that figure several times over. Riyadh calculated that the cost of independent naval capability was less than the cost of continued vulnerability to Iranian disruption threats. But the military hardware tells only part of the story. The operational doctrine behind the deployment represents an equally significant departure from historical Saudi defense posture. For decades, Saudi Arabia's naval strategy was fundamentally defensive: protect the kingdom's coastline, escort Saudi-flagged tankers during periods of elevated threat, and defer to the United States Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, for all power projection and deterrence missions in the open Gulf. The doctrine that governed this morning's deployment is something entirely different. Riyadh is asserting area security responsibility, the obligation to protect all commercial shipping within a defined zone, regardless of flag state, registry, or destination. That is a capability and a commitment that only the United States and, to a limited extent, the United Kingdom have previously exercised in these waters. The timing also intersects with a critical development in Saudi Arabia's defense industrial base that has received insufficient analytical attention. The kingdom's General Authority for Military Industries announced in February that domestic production of naval ammunition, including 76mm gun rounds and close-in weapon system ammunition, had reached self-sufficiency. Saudi Arabia is no longer dependent on emergency resupply from foreign manufacturers to sustain naval operations in a prolonged deployment. That logistical independence transforms the deployment from a symbolic gesture into a sustainable operational posture. A navy that can resupply from domestic stockpiles can maintain position indefinitely. A navy dependent on foreign ammunition shipments can be pressured through supply chain diplomacy. Tehran understands the difference. The reaction from other Gulf Cooperation Council states in the hours following the Saudi deployment further illuminates the coordinated nature of this strategic shift. The United Arab Emirates Naval Forces repositioned 2 Bainuna-class corvettes from Abu Dhabi to patrol sectors adjacent to the Saudi formation. Bahrain, which hosts the United States Fifth Fleet headquarters, issued a statement expressing full support for collective Gulf maritime security. Oman, which has historically maintained careful neutrality between Iran and the Arab Gulf states and controls the southern shore of the Strait of Hormuz, notably did not object to the deployment and permitted Saudi naval communications to transit Omani military frequencies, a technical detail that signals far more than any diplomatic statement. Now, here is where the analysis becomes truly critical, and this is what most coverage is completely missing. Iran's response to the Saudi deployment reveals a regime in the advanced stages of strategic paralysis. Within 6 hours of the Saudi naval movement, the Supreme National Security Council convened an emergency session in Tehran. According to reporting from Iran international sighting sources within the Iranian government, the session produced no consensus on response. The IRGC Naval Command advocated immediate provocative action, deploying fast attack boats to shadow the Saudi frigates, conducting live fire exercises within visual range of the formation, and issuing public threats of retaliation. The conventional military leadership, represented by the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, argued for diplomatic protests through the United Nations and bilateral channels. The Foreign Ministry pushed for emergency communication with Beijing, requesting Chinese diplomatic intervention to reverse the Saudi posture. 3 factions, 3 incompatible strategies, no resolution. That is the definition of strategic paralysis. The personalities involved deepen the dysfunction. Ahmad Vahidi, the senior military advisor whose personal history includes command responsibility for operations stretching from Lebanon to Argentina, who carries an Interpol red notice that has followed him for 3 decades, favors confrontation because confrontation is the only strategic language he has ever spoken. Masoud Peshkan, navigating between reformist instincts and regime loyalty, recognizes that military escalation against a Saudi American formation would be catastrophic, but lacks the institutional power to overrule the IRGC. These are not colleagues collaborating on national strategy. These are 4 men from the barracks of 1988 carrying 40 years of accumulated grievances into a crisis that demands unity they are structurally incapable of producing. This paralysis is not accidental. It reflects a structural crisis within the Iranian regime that has been building for years. The IRGC controls an estimated 30 to 40% of Iran's domestic economy through construction companies, telecommunications firms, oil service contracts, banking operations, and port management. The IRGC's institutional survival depends on the perception of external threat that justifies its economic privileges and political influence. A Saudi Arabia that can independently guarantee Gulf security undermines the IRGC's fundamental value proposition to the Iranian state, that without the Revolutionary Guard's deterrent capability, Iran's enemies would dominate the Gulf unchallenged. The economic dimensions compound the strategic crisis. Iran's oil export revenue, already constrained by sanctions enforcement, depends on the perception that Tehran retains the ability to disrupt Gulf shipping and therefore must be accommodated rather than confronted. If Saudi Arabia demonstrates that Gulf shipping can be secured without Iranian cooperation or acquiescence, then the implicit bargain that has sustained Iran's negotiating position collapses entirely. Iran's daily oil export revenue of approximately $150 million becomes vulnerable, not because anyone is blockading Iranian ports, but because Iran's leverage to prevent others from being blockaded disappears. The Chinese dimension of this crisis deserves particular attention. Beijing imports approximately 1.5 million barrels of Iranian crude oil per day, making China Iran's largest customer and most important economic lifeline. Chinese strategic calculations in the Gulf have historically balanced between maintaining access to Iranian oil at discounted prices and preserving relationships with Gulf Arab states that supply an additional 3.8 million barrels per day to Chinese refineries. The Saudi naval deployment forces Beijing into an uncomfortable recalculation. If Saudi Arabia can guarantee Gulf shipping security independently, then China's interest in maintaining Iranian leverage over Gulf transit diminishes significantly. Beijing's priority is uninterrupted energy supply, not Iranian strategic ambitions. Sources familiar with Chinese diplomatic communications indicate that Beijing's initial private response to Riyadh was not protest, but inquiry, asking Saudi officials for detailed briefings on the scope and duration of the naval deployment, the rules of engagement governing Saudi forces, and whether the deployment would affect commercial shipping schedules. That response tells the strategic story more clearly than any public statement. Make sure you are subscribed and that notification bell is activated because the developments over the next 72 hours will determine the trajectory of Gulf security for the next decade, and this channel will be covering every dimension as it unfolds. The historical parallel that most accurately frames this moment is not, as some analysts have suggested, the 1980s tanker war during the Iran-Iraq conflict. The more precise comparison is the British withdrawal from the Gulf in 1971, which created the security vacuum that the United States gradually filled over the subsequent 2 decades. What is happening now represents a potential third phase in Gulf security architecture: the transition from American guaranteed security to a model where regional powers, led by Saudi Arabia, share responsibility for maritime security with American support rather than dependence. Consider what that transition means in practical terms. Since 1995, the United States has maintained a carrier strike group presence in or near the Persian Gulf on a near-continuous rotation basis. That commitment costs American taxpayers approximately $5 billion annually in direct operational expenses, fuel, maintenance, personnel deployment costs, and wear on hulls and aircraft that accelerates replacement timelines. The political sustainability of that commitment has eroded steadily as American strategic attention shifts toward the Indo-Pacific theater and domestic constituencies question why a nation producing 2 million barrels of oil per day domestically continues to bear the primary cost of securing Gulf oil that flows overwhelmingly to Asian markets. Saudi Arabia's willingness to shoulder a greater share of that burden aligns with a strategic rebalancing that both Riyadh and Washington have pursued quietly for years, but never operationalized until now. Operation Praying Mantis in 1988 demonstrated that Iran's naval forces could not withstand direct American military engagement. In a single day of combat, the United States Navy destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms, sank 1 frigate, 1 gunboat, and damaged a 2nd frigate, while losing no vessels. That engagement established the military reality that has persisted for nearly 4 decades. Iran cannot win a conventional naval confrontation in the Gulf. What the Saudi deployment adds to this equation is the demonstration that Iran now faces potential opposition, not only from American forces operating from distant bases, but from regional naval power positioned permanently in Gulf waters, with the capability and the political will to act independently. The Russian dimension is present but secondary. Moscow's ability to influence Gulf security dynamics is limited by geographic distance, naval capability constraints, and the reality that Russia benefits from Gulf instability that elevates global oil prices. Russian diplomatic statements supporting Iranian sovereignty claims in the Gulf should be understood as performative solidarity rather than actionable commitment. Moscow will not deploy naval forces to the Persian Gulf to challenge a Saudi-American maritime security framework. More cynically, Russian energy companies stand to capture market share if Iranian exports decline further. Moscow's public solidarity with Tehran masks a private calculation that Iranian weakness serves Russian commercial interests. The financial markets absorbed the news with a precision that reveals how clearly traders understood the implications. Brent crude futures dropped $8.40 per barrel in the 4 hours following confirmation of the Saudi deployment, not because supply was disrupted, but because the market recognized that the long-term risk premium associated with Iranian disruption threats had fundamentally decreased. If Saudi Arabia can guarantee transit security, then the probability of a sustained Strait of Hormuz closure drops from unlikely to near impossible, and the risk premium that has inflated oil prices for decades begins to deflate. Goldman Sachs issued an intraday note to clients, estimating that sustained Saudi-American maritime security cooperation could remove between $6 and $11 per barrel from the long-term Brent price baseline. That translates to savings of approximately $0. 14-0. 26 per gallon at American gasoline pumps, a number that connects distant naval operations directly to household budgets. The implications radiating outward from this single deployment touch every major strategic question in the Middle East simultaneously. The Iranian nuclear program, which Tehran has used as a parallel leverage mechanism alongside Gulf shipping threats, loses negotiating weight if the shipping threat is neutralized. The Houthi campaign in Yemen, which Iran has supported partly to create a second maritime threat axis in the Red Sea, becomes strategically orphaned if the primary Gulf threat is contained. The ongoing negotiations over regional normalization, paused since the collapse of the Abraham Accords expansion, receive new momentum if Saudi Arabia demonstrates security independence that reduces the perceived risk of formal diplomatic engagement with Israel. Every one of these threads remains unresolved. The Saudi warships are in position. The Iranian Security Council has not reached consensus. Chinese diplomats are asking questions rather than issuing demands. The United States Navy is providing coordination support while allowing Saudi Arabia to lead publicly, a posture that suggests Washington planned this outcome months in advance. The question that no analyst can answer with certainty is what Tehran does next. The IRGC has options ranging from symbolic provocation to direct confrontation, but every option carries risks that the fractured Iranian leadership may not be prepared to accept. A provocative gesture that triggers Saudi or American military response would validate the deployment and potentially escalate into a confrontation Iran cannot win. Restraint preserves Iranian military assets, but concedes the strategic point that Gulf security no longer depends on Iranian acquiescence. A covert response, activating proxy forces in Iraq or Lebanon to strike Saudi infrastructure on land, risks triggering a wider regional conflict that Tehran's depleted conventional forces are not positioned to sustain. Every door leads to a room Iran does not want to enter. And then there is the nuclear dimension, hovering behind every tactical calculation like a shadow that changes the shape of everything it falls upon. Iran's uranium enrichment program, which the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in its most recent quarterly report, has produced 128. 3 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, just one technical step below weapons grade, has been Tehran's ultimate insurance policy, even more fundamental than the Strait of Hormuz threat. But a nuclear deterrent that does not yet exist cannot deter a naval deployment that is happening right now. The timeline mismatch is devastating to Iranian strategic planning. Riyadh moved before Tehran's nuclear program could provide the umbrella of protection that might have made this deployment unthinkable. The clock is running. Iran's storage facilities for crude oil are approaching capacity, with estimates suggesting 14 to 18 days before domestic storage is completely full and wellhead shutdowns begin. Shutdowns that cause irreversible geological damage to aging oil fields that have been producing continuously since the 1960s. Once a mature reservoir undergoes unplanned shutdown, the pressure dynamics that enable extraction are permanently altered. Recovery rates decline by 8 to 15% permanently. That is not a political problem that can be reversed by a change in leadership or a new diplomatic agreement. That is physics destroying economic assets that took decades to develop. Every day of strategic paralysis in Tehran is a day closer to a threshold that transforms a political crisis into an economic catastrophe from which there is no recovery. The next 48 hours will determine whether Iran's leadership can overcome its internal divisions to formulate a coherent response, whether Saudi Arabia's deployment survives its first operational test, and whether the security architecture of the most economically consequential waterway on Earth has permanently changed. What happens next will reshape not just the Persian Gulf, but the global energy order that depends on it. Drop your analysis in the comments. Do you believe Iran will attempt a military response, or has Tehran already lost this round without a shot being fired?